Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Telegram. If anybody's interested in supporting, support me on Locals, where you can get updates on future programs, notifications for programs. Sometimes, as I said, YouTube doesn't always give people notifications, as well as interact with and support the channel. You can also support me with Buy Me a Coffee and Subscribe Star. As well as around the 45 minute mark, I'll begin to engage with the chat. Super chats will be read first. Other chats will be read as time permits or they're relevant to the discussion. Beginning last week, I started having a new list of thumbnails people might be noticing. Those are from Censored Anon, so I wanted to give him a shout out. His contact information is in the description box. So he does some pretty good work, so check him out there. All right, so today's discussion, Modem Society and the Modem Man, episode 39 of the Casual Stream. Let's see who's in the chat. We got JLM, Cyber Ninja Zero, TB9K, and Minoan. Well, hello, everybody. All right. These are all taken from Ellul's On Technique. As long as technique was represented exclusively by the machine, it was possible to speak of man and the machine. The machine remained an external object. And man, though significantly influenced by it in his professional, private, and psychic life, remained nonetheless independent. He was in a position to assert himself apart from the machine. He was able to adopt a position with respect to it. But when technique enters into the area of life, including the human, it ceases to be external to man and becomes his very substance. It is no longer face-to-face with man, but is integrated with him, and it progressively absorbs him. In this respect, technique is radically different from the machine. The transformation so obvious in Modem Society is the result of the fact that technique has become autonomous. All right, well, what's interesting here is if you look at these two paragraphs, the first paragraph, man is distinct from the machine, corresponds to Illich's distal age of tools. And the second paragraph here, and technique embedded in the life of man corresponds to Illich's age of systems. Now, Ellul wrote this before Illich, but nonetheless, we can see the pattern that is developing that Illich later comments on and describes in more concrete details. The Modem Society is the de facto expression of the age of systems. Man is absorbed into the process. He is a subcomponent of a subsystem of the process. To the extent he is incorporated in technique, to just that extent he ceases to be a man and becomes a machine. Now, why does Illich, or Ellul rather, use the term modem society? So a modem is a converter that takes signals from most broadly speaking, takes signals from one device, converts it into signals that another device can understand. Most people would be familiar with modems with regards to the old internet dial-up, where you had two devices, a computer and a phone, and they had to communicate with each other. And the modem, which is a modulator-demodulator, would be, otherwise you have to have two separate devices, a modulating device and a demodulating device. But you put them into one, you call them a modem. That's the shorthand. Now, when Ellul wrote this, this was well before dial-up, well before personal computers. I think the only real thing he had was like telephones and maybe some big government computers that were being used. But what he means by this is that man, and we'll get to this more as we go through some of the relevant passages, but man is being converted into a modem. Man is a modulator-demodulator device. That's what he's being turned into in this system. Back to Ellul. The worst reproach Modem Society can level is the charge that some person or system is impeding this technical automatism. When a labor union leader says, in a period of recession, productivity is a social scourge, his declaration stirs up a storm of protest and condemnation because he is putting a personal judgment before the technical axiom that what can be produced must be produced. If the axiom can yield a given result, it must be used to capacity, and that it is considered criminal antisocial not to do so. Technical automatism may not be judged or questioned. Immediate use must be found for the most recent, efficient, and technical process. And then this is my commentary. The systems of devices sending and receiving signals, of which man is one such device in the system of modems, or the Modem Society, production must be set to the full. Any idea that anyone would even conceive of not producing what could be produced is insane. The signal is sent, the human modem must of necessity send the signal to another device for the sake of production. Now, this also, of course, predates the computer age. In Paul Mazur's American Prosperity in the early 20s, he was the president of Lehman Brothers. He pointed out that he sort of spoke of the market in this sort of like quasi-mystical sense, that the fact that you could produce something meant that you must. Now, this was an industrial society, a technical society, but not yet an information society. But we also see the sort of market expression of this insight that what can be done must be done. And this isn't just in the context of like, well, if the Soviets put a satellite into space, they could then put missiles into space, so the U.S. has to match them. Yes, that's a sort of like prisoner's dilemma. We have to do it. But this is more like intra-system. If it can be done, it must be done, not from fear of the enemy doing it, but because of the necessities of technique interlocking with itself. Technical civilization means that our civilization is constructed by technique, makes a part of civilization only what belongs to technique. For technique, in that everything in this civilization must serve a technical end, and is exclusively technique in that it excludes whatever is not technique or reduces it to technical form. We can see this is actually the case in certain phenomena considered essential to civilization, for example, art and literature. The activities in a modem society are tightly subordinated in different ways to technical necessities by direct interference of technique. Take, for example, the motion pictures, radio, and television. The media require great capital. These media require great capital investment. As a result, artistic expressions is subordinate to a censorship of money or of the state. This censorship most often takes the form of indirect influences, which again may assume different guises. Personal music is supplanted by the radio, and painting, threatened by photography, is obliged to modify itself by becoming abstract so as not to be a mere substitute for production. Modem art and literature manifest in all other points their subordination to the technique which has extended its power over all activity and hence over all culture. All culture and art becomes bastardized and ceases to be an expression of the true, the beautiful, and the good, but rather a signal for the system of systems to communicate to men, to them how better to fit into the system and become better modems. So, yeah, this is it. This is what's interesting too, right? Since technique and efficiency is the only goal, things like art, literature, and philosophy just become extraneous. They don't help facilitate the effective manipulation of objects via technique or production or anything like that. So you can't efface them immediately. It takes time. And now what we see with the sort of schlock coming out of Hollywood can more broadly be described as a result of this phenomena, that things which were considered indispensable to civilization are now considered not only not essential, but useless. Also, this explains the distinction that was made during the COVID lockdown pandemic about essential and, quote, non-essential businesses. Things like churches were considered not essential because, like art, literature, and history, they were not efficient. They did not facilitate technique. Whereas things like bars and strip clubs, while what they do is they are a form of technique for people that aren't working. It's a way for them to blow off steam and get ready for the next day of work in a way that is technique controlled because it's still consumers consuming services and exchanging money, which is necessary for all this. So it's kind of a losing bid to complain about churches being non-essential, being closed down, because from the point of view of the machine and technique, they are not essential. At this very moment, technical synthesis could bring about the total elimination of the state in the traditional sense. The framework in which society exists could get along well enough without the traditional state, and perhaps even do better without it. The technological state corresponds directly to modem society itself, since it's technically constructed and exists in the very soul of man, who worship order, efficiency, order, and speed. The classical state corresponds to vanishing forces of an entirely different nature. We shift from one mode of socio-political life to another. The modes of social interaction in the old tradition of state are fading away into nothing, with the new modem relations predominating. So this is a sort of a preface to the big reveal here. Society before and after the machine, and what are the fundamental differences. But what Ellul is saying here is that with the technical system, the age of technique that we are living in, it is developing radically new and radically different ways for human relationships to develop. Not only vis-a-vis each other, but vis-a-vis the state, and most importantly, vis-a-vis tools. This may be they may be associations for sport or culture, the goals of which is clearly recognizable. They may be labor unions, which have their characteristic relation to life through the economy, this last being conditioned by technique. They may be communities like the kibbutzim, whose object is to exploit techniques while allowing man a normal life. In every kind of modem society, there's a predominance of techniques. The social morphology of these societies indeed differs radically from that of traditional ones. Traditional societies were centered upon human needs and instincts, for example, in family, clan, and seniority. Modem societies, on the other hand, are centered on technical necessity and derivatively, of course, on human adherence. Man in modem societies is not situated in relation to other men, but in relation to technique. For this reason, the sociological structure of these societies is completely altered. There is no longer any question of autonomous collectives or groups with specific values and orientations. Modem collectivities and groups have no existence beyond technique. They are representatives of the major tendency of our time. So this is probably one of the most important references on technique, because it demarcates the fundamental difference between everything before and everything after the tyranny of technique. This finally explains the central question that directed my inquiries from 2006 onwards. Why did all of the normal ways of relating to people, building social networks with people, and establishing oneself that work for all of human history suddenly stop working? At the age of 19, I was way out of my depth on that one. After 13 years of study, I have a better idea. It can really be reduced to the simple fact that man has turned himself into a ridiculous parody of organic life, an organic modem. He has flattened out all of the depth of the human soul into a thin gruel of material efficiency. Like Esau, modem man has sold his birthright for a bowl of pottage. Efficiency. So let me explain in a way that I've been sort of hinting at in other videos. Ellul makes this very important point. He says that for this reason, the sociological structure of societies is completely altered. This goes back to my very first casual stream episode. So in this was typically used as a sort of put down, though it doesn't necessarily have to be construed as such, the idea that earlier societies there were things called women's work. Now, what that meant was primarily with regards to childcare. So, for example, not only do you have to have the children, that's where midwives come in. Not only do you have to feed the children, that's where wet nurses come in. You have to clothe them and take care of them. And of course, what often would happen is these women would do it together. So, for example, like imagine a Native American tribe after the men had hunted and killed the buffalo, and the buffalo was carved up, the skin was turned into leather for clothing, the hairy outside was used for winter clothes, the meat was cooked for food, and the bones were turned into tools. They did all this together. They would sit around, depending on the time of year, they would sit around the fire, maybe in a longhouse or a tent, a wigwam, and socialize together, all doing this. So there were techniques, like these women all worked together in this informal economy, and they were developing techniques, but they were relating to each other. Not only to each other, but relating to the larger whole, the tribe and the clan, such that what their activities were doing were directed towards further human flourishing within that context. And so now, one of the big problems that we hear all the time is the declining birth rates, declining marriage rates. Well, the entire social structure has changed. It's changed because all of the things necessary for that to happen in prior societies is gone. And it's gone because it's not efficient. It doesn't serve the needs of the machine. It doesn't serve the needs of capital. And so it's been done away with, just like art, literature, philosophy, and churches. And so that's a very tangible, real-world example of how this completely gutted and destroyed prior institutions. The other thing is how people relate to each other. So, if you wanted resources in previous societies, well, there's a good example in the film Lawrence of Arabia. Anthony Quinn plays the Arab chieftain Abu Taib of the Hawathat, and he says that even though the Turks pay him money to leave Aqaba alone, he is not rich because he is a river to his people. He gives of what he receives in tribute to his clan. Now, in order to get resources in the past, you had to build patronage systems. And that meant, building relationships with those men in the tribe, or in more complex societies, those businessmen or state officials that could provide you with these services. Now you relate to bureaucrats, you relate to technical processes. What would have worked in the days of the Roman Republic won't work now, because the sort of social bonds that were necessary to make society work have been replaced by technique, and so they don't exist anymore. And this radically flattening, dehumanized society we live in is because we can't relate to each other as people. We have to relate to each other as technique, as other aspects of the machine. So because the machine, because I finished the Machine Stops last week, and chapter 3, they say the machine clothes us, the machine feeds us, the machine gives us shelter. All the things needful for life are given by the machine. So our primary mode of relating is to the machine in order to get what we need to live, which then means you relate to other people that way too, which creates a lot of problems because people aren't machines. They're not meant to be related in that way. And so that is an extremely insightful moment that he has for us here, Ellul. Modem society is moving towards mass society, but the human being is still not fully adapted to this new form. Now, he wrote this in the 50s, and I say what was once an open question has now been decisively answered. No, man cannot adapt to this system. I mean, we have problems that Ellul couldn't even dream of. I mean, incels and, malnourished, goblins shambling around, people that look more like Vashti, white as fungus without teeth or hair. Yeah, unless Ellul read The Machine Stops, I don't think he could have really considered what was going to go down. So then the question is, what does all this really entail or mean? A lot of things. So what is the modem man? He is a ridiculous caricature of a man who has replaced real, meaningful social interactions with his own kind with sending and receiving signals from devices. First for work. This is serious. I need to keep production quotas on time, he says. He must have time off the work so that time is filled with other devices for his amusement. So he relates to the radio, he relates to the television, he relates to the internet. And so all of these are now sending and receiving signals, which is in one sense is catechizing him into the machine life. Because even when he's not working, even when he's quote unquote having leisure, which of course is a bastardization of the term. Aristotle said leisure is what we do so that we might philosophize. That's not what people are doing when they're not working. They're being catechized to be modems, even by the well. There's an Adbusters commercial from like the 90s where the guy has a barcode on the back of his neck, and the guy's watching commercials, and it says "You are the product." But it's more sinister than that. You're not just the product. You're just a modem. You're just this sort of subsystem component of the technological society. These devices are still sending him signals, and he is converting these signals into new signals, actions that make him fitted to go back to work. Adam Smith once said, with regards to the division of labor, it makes one as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. Turns out he was off. The process of turning man into a modem will make him as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become. What are the features of the modem man? The modem man cannot be reasoned out of his beliefs, for as the old saying goes, you cannot reason people out of something they were not reasoned into. His beliefs are not formed by ratiocination, syllogisms, or reading, but from signals. He receives a steady diet of signals from the machine, from contradictory simulations or earlier stages of material existence, see my simulacrum in culture and simulacrum in history videos, forming his view of things. If you attack any discrete belief he will become defensive. He cannot defend the beliefs. He doesn't even know why he believes them. But more to the point, you are not sending the right signal. He wants you to send him a signal like the machine does. A syllogism of fact and logic are not the signal he is capable of receiving. This is why we find the cartoonish observation that in a debate, especially online debates, the two interlocutors are both declared winners by their own side, regardless of their performance, right? Because the base is a device receiving signals from the interlocutor in the debate. And so it's like, yeah, we got the signal. He won. But that's not winning. That's not winning a debate. That's just sending a signal to the base. Whether that was their intent or not is another question, but that's how many who view debates interpret this. We even have slang for this, signal to the base. It is perverse in its simplicity. You really are signaling. You are a machine. Debate does work. It is the most useful way to communicate ideas to your fellow man, with one major caveat. It doesn't work on modem men. Modem men can only receive signals, not syllogisms. The preconditions for debate are more or less impossible these days because nearly all concerned are modem men. Now, that's not to say that all men are modem men. I found a few here and there that aren't. But, to use the old proverb, they're as rare as hen's teeth. It's really hard to find. Communication, not only with those on the left or normies, but even intra-right, are fraught with friction and uncertainty because we are not reasoning with each other, at least most of us, but rather sending signals to each other. Signals that in most cases the machine itself cannot even receive anymore because they are already obsolete. A good example of this is the recent Christian v. Pagan and RP versus Tradcon debates, which began last year and are continuing into this year. We see two groups of modems signaling at each other that they do not do anything except elicit hostile responses from each other. This also leads to friction in romantic relations. Men and women are not relating to each other as men and women, but as biological units of the opposite sex being compressed into the category of a fungible modem carbon unit. TLDR doesn't work out well. What we've seen in romantic relationships is men and women trying to relate to each other as though they would relate to the machine. Men send signals to women. Women send signals to men. Signals are not capable of being received. A fight ensues. Now, the reason why these signals are not capable of being received is because men and women have developed these contradictory set of identities based on my video episode of Simulacrum and Culture, where I get into that more. Even the machine cannot accept these signals anymore because they are obsolete. We need to rediscover the traditional ways of relating man to man, or in this case, man to woman. And so this also explains why we see the rise of things like, basically sex bots, why many of the manosphere are in favor of that. Because it's a kind of like synthetic technique woman where they can send the signals that they want to this surrogate woman and she'll reciprocate. It's turned her into a robot, into a machine. And so it's now the full culminating point of this machine thinking, this technique thinking. And so instead of relating to a human being, qua human being, you relate to plastic as some device you're sending a signal to that's sending it back to you. In order to escape the machine, one must first stop becoming the machine. This is why this will be very hard, since in order to get food, clothes, and shelter, we're required to an extent to signal to the machine for those things. But we don't have to carry over this absurd form of social interaction into relationships with our fellow man. Beginning the restoration, to begin restoring authentic human relationships. And then from there, a resistance to the machine can form. So this is a nice segue into some other questions that I've been asked by people recently. Given the omnipresence of all this, how exactly are we to take all this information in and deal with it? One, know what you're doing. I mean, to some extent, we all have to signal to the machine to get what we want, to get what we need. And that can't be helped. But know that you're doing it and don't pretend that you're not, first of all. Second of all, create boundaries, right? Technology is a kind of erasure that seeks to erase boundaries. So think about like the smartphone, right? Once smartphones become sufficiently proliferated, everybody in the home has one. And so rather than rooms in the home, one room is the kitchen, one room is the dining room, one room is the bedroom, one room is the living room. They all become the same, where people just hang out with their phones. Kind of erases boundaries, which creates a lot of confusion and anxiety. So what you should do is, once you realize what you are doing, and to some extent you have to, one, admit that. Two, minimize to the extent that you have to do that. I mean, obviously we can go out of our way to do it more or less, depending on individual circumstances. I would recommend doing less. Create boundaries, and then in as much as is possible, relate to other human beings in a real way rather than in a modem way. Now, of course, many of them are going to be modem men, or modem women. And so in that case, that's going to be difficult because they're not going to necessarily get the signal either, because you're not sending the signal they can pick up on. Now, this process can never be, in my mind, completely finished, because man is a biological organism, not something made of silicon like a computer. So in that regard, there will always be some residual humanity left, however deformed, from which you can, if you can identify through observation and experience, start to feed that so that it grows at the expense of the machine, at the expense of the modemization, if you will, of these men. And when you do that, you begin to carve out spaces. You might call them like sanctuary spaces, where technique and modem operations don't exist. These will initially be social and pleasure, or the probably the second level of friendship, as Aristotle said, that of pleasure. You enjoy being with these people. Ideally, we would want this to also include both utility, because once we can include utility, the sense of friendship of who's useful, you can now relate to other people for what you need. So a perfect example of how one might do this in real life is if you happen to live near a farm, or maybe, well, especially if I say a farm, and of course they have milk, eggs, cheese, hopefully, animal meat products that they've, killed and cut up. You can begin building relationships with these people and relate to them for your daily sustenance without having to relate to some abstract, technical monstrosity like a grocery store, or even worse, DoorDash. So, again, not everybody can do that. So the goal is to identify when you're acting like a modem, and that you have to some extent in order to interface with the society as a whole to get the resources you need to survive. But then sort of demarcate that off, and then have another side of your life where you begin the process of rediscovering how to relate to man, so that you can eventually prepare for the catabolic collapse, which is coming, where signaling like a modem into the ether will just get you killed, because there's no more machine to pick up the signal once catabolic collapse reaches its final stages. So, that's not great, but there is some hope. And so the goal is not to completely disassociate yourself from the technological society, because again, currently that's nearly impossible. But what the practical goal is just to rely on it as little as possible, and reorient your life in such a way that you don't need to rely on it more than is absolutely necessary. And then you can use that in order to create these sort of spaces where you can engage in more traditional direct human interactions, so that you don't become the modem. And the other thing that I think is interesting about this is that it does explain very well, as I mentioned earlier, why so many debates break bad. It's like, people take it way too personally. The points never get communicated. And in part, the points never get communicated because we're dealing with two modems sending signals to each other that they're not capable of picking up. They're in many ways, I know people have, some of you have been watching my Moldbug stream of Logos. We've sort of actually had to play the role of modems in order to communicate between these two other groups, the two groups that stand up. I mean, a good example would be when I tried to thread the needle between the TradCon RP debate that was going on, that led to me being on the Academic Agents channel, and then later on Muse's channel to talk with Red Hawk. Again, sometimes it's necessary to do that, because, as I said, you can't reason people out of something they weren't first reasoned into. But it's also, in the long term, not ideal. It's something that you have to do. For lack of a better word, it's a necessary evil, but you have to begin to wean yourself off of it, because it won't be there. And we need to get to the point where other people are sufficiently prepared for this, so that there's something left to work with in order to move beyond this. And it's also necessary in order to restore and recapture the things that make life worth living, like art, literature, philosophy, and religion. All of these things have been squeezed out because they're not efficient. And so the Modem man, see, this is actually why we have new atheists, right? These sort of like, boorish Philistine troglodytes, which have no sense of aesthetics, are because they are extremely far advanced in becoming Modem men. They don't understand art. They don't understand literature. They don't understand philosophy. They just understand these crude signals that are being sent back and forth. And that's also why debating new atheists largely doesn't work, because they're not capable of being reasoned with. They're just modems. And they're more far along advanced because, they have a vested interest in the industrial technological society. And it leads to this, complete flattening and parodization of humanity. And so that's awful. We don't want more of that. And even as Dawkins said a few years back, that the New Atheist Project was a failure and he's done fighting against religion. Yeah, well, no duh. That was never going to be a success. I don't know why anybody thought it would be. It goes against everything that we know. And so what I think is going on here is the reason why progressivism, new atheism, humanism, secularism, atheism, all of these things that we sort of rail against were selected for was because they were those subcultures within our community that had most accommodated themselves to modem life and were picking up the signals that were being sent by the machine better than us, better than the rest of us. And the machine rewarded them accordingly. But what it turns out, as many in the sphere already know, that these people were not actually qualified for any sort of leadership or management skills and any sort of objective standard. They were only selected because they sent the right signals back. And so now we have this weird reality where by reducing everything to a set of signals being sent and returned, we no longer have qualified people in charge, because the people that get in charge just sent the right signals to the machine. And so I believe this also explains why these groups rose at the expense of other groups, because they were more like that. And again, to highlight this against earlier traditional forms of society, most of us have no idea what that's like. No, I've read a lot of history and literature over the years, so I have a much better idea of what life used to be like for most people. Those who are turning online or public education or just never read history or literature, again, those things are selected against already because they're not efficient. So again, you have to really go out of your way to expose yourself to these things. It's radically different, and those societies were radically more satisfying, which is why when the industrial process started, it met with such ferocious resistance. Right, even within England itself, you had the Luddites. The Native Americans fought against westward expansion of the U.S. Republic. You had organized labor in the United States. A lot of people fought this either in total, right? The Luddites just don't even let it happen. Try to co-opt or control it like the unions, but eventually, because they had state patronage. I mean, right, when the Luddites attack a weaver mill, whose side does the government take? Well, the weaver mills. So of course the Luddites lose. But one could easily have envisioned an alternative scenario where the government stood on the side of the Luddites, in which case this doesn't happen. But, that's just an alternative history that we'll never really know. But it's relating, we talk about low trust society. Well, it's a low trust between men, right? But it's a very, quote, high trust society vis-a-vis the individual and the machine apparatus, because we trust the machine apparatus implicitly for all of our sustenance. And the fact that it's breaking down after COVID and the lockdowns and the disruptions to global supply chains is really getting people nervous because they don't know what to do. It's like they lack even the imagination to consider alternatives. And most of the alternatives that I've seen floated on the internet across all political spectrums of dissident radicals are woefully inadequate because they don't fully understand what life was like before and what life will likely be like after all this is over. And it's the idea that you relate to each other. This actually ties into the talk that I gave 2 weeks ago about politics, political theory. The idea that there was the rule of the one, the few, and the many, and then there was the fourth form of government, which is an assemblage of all of the other three, which is proposed by Cicero. And the idea was that you created the state was considered an organism, right? Where the humans, the men that operated the state were considered cells, if you will, within this organism, and it worked for some common objective, usually the maintenance of the people that supported it, so the tribe, the clan, and later the state. And in that regard, these things were based on patronage systems where you had a patron and a client, and you had to build a relationship with them. You had to show that you could trust them. You had to show that you could offer something of value. Now, those things of value once included art, literature, poetry, philosophy. They don't now, not anymore. There was a deconstructionist phase when that stuff was considered valuable only insofar as you could use it to deconstruct. But we've kind of moved beyond that. Now we just get schlock. We don't get anything even remotely good to tempt people away because they've already locked us in to this machine. And so the real challenge here is for people to begin to think in terms that are not modem terms. How would you reason to a conclusion? And the study in Scarlet, Sherlock Holmes says, there's two ways of reasoning: synthetic from a premise to a conclusion, and analytic from an observed reality back to a chain of causal events that might have caused it, or that maybe even must have caused it, such as a coroner determining cause of death of a corpse. Well, we're reasoning back from what must have killed this individual. That's not a signal, at least not in the sort of electronic sense of what a modem is. And then also relating to people. So the other thing this is something else I thought about. We'll also see how in a lot of social interactions, especially online, but even in real life, there's a sense in which people just are constantly rubbing each other the wrong way. And they just don't even notice it until they blow up at each other, and then they don't know why. And it's in large part because their primary orientation is not to each other, but to the machine. So all of these subtle cues of body language, okay, hey, you're this is upsetting me. I don't like this. They're not picking those up because they're not they're not conditioned to pick those up, or even if they could pick them up, they choose not to because they're more interested in picking up signals from the machine. And so it really hurts interpersonal relationships on the grassroots level, which is to the machine's benefit, because if we don't work together, well, we're not going to be a threat to it. And so that's not good. So to sum all this up, as we wrap it up, is the modem society is fundamentally different than all prior societies, and because man does not relate man to man, but he relates man to technique or to tools, right? The systems that Illich talks about. The idea then is that man receives a signal, he then converts it into another signal, and that's all he is. He's just taking signals and receiving signals, taking signals and receiving signals. A really good example of this parody is a libertarian. The market sends him a signal, beep, beep, signal, beep, beep. We got a market fluctuation, you might want to invest in gold, and he sends up the signal. Then the gold investor picks up the signal from Mr. Libertarian, beep, beep, beep. He sends him the signal. We see this with all sorts of people. I'm just picking on libertarians. And because modem societies value efficiency and technique above all else, we lose art, we lose culture, we lose literature, philosophy, religion. These things are declared non-essential in a lockdown, but liquor stores and strip clubs are considered essential. So that's how a technological society works, guys. And lastly, the question of our day really is, how do we... Now, he doesn't elaborate on this, but the kibbutz, whose object is to exploit techniques while allowing man a normal life. I feel like something like that should be our goal in the interim, because we have to live normal lives in order to be ready for catabolic collapse. So we'll end with the call to be something like the kibbutz. All right, what do we have in the chat? JLM points for a clever title at a bare minimum. Well, hopefully more than that. Paul Moosefoot, dial-up nationalism. No. Minoan, I am the Modem man. Sticks, Mr. Roboto. Yikes. No, Minoan. That's not my tummy. That was the garage door closing. Never mind. That was. No, what are you talking about? Let's see. Paul Moosefoot, Ellul is based. Yes, super based. Sunny Jim, hello. And ironic coolness, also Catholics versus Protestants, Amnats versus anti-Americans. Yep. Paul Moosefoot, Modem men in their pods inside the longhouse. Ooh, that's a nice synthesis there. Good. Minoan, perhaps women are more amenable to the machine, and that's why so much of society has been feminized. Thoughts? Well, I think one thing is technique has the machine has replaced man as the provider, and so there's this sort of like if they want to be provided for. Well, okay, one is we all know about how the state and very wealthy men can become quote unquote sugar daddies. That's part of it. And that's also why they select for these, quote unquote, high performing men that tend to be, on the carousel, so to speak, moving around from woman to woman, because they're the ones that are best tied into technique in order to gain money and resources. Right? If you want to gain money and resources, you have to be very well dialed into the system, to the machine, and send it the right signals. And so women, in order to get those resources, side with men like that. And then also, there's an element in which if you can get something for nothing, if you can perceive it that way, you're more inclined to do it. I think the main reason why, from a technical point of view, I guess the reason why women would be more comfortable in this society is that it fundamentally allows them to do things that they could never have done in any prior human civilization because of obvious biological limitations and lack of material conditions. Minoan, humanism has been around a long time. Yeah, it has. And it kind of begins in the Renaissance with the age of finance. These things are connected. Ellul invented the concept of virtue signaling. Well, he explains it. I don't know if he invented it, but modern Nathan C.J. Hood, modern man, writes his posts on Open Office writer. Minoan, is the Anglo world responsible for the current technological society? They started the Industrial Revolution. Well, it was England and Belgium which industrialized more or less at the same time, though England was able to become more powerful in the process. Ellul argues that with the development and formation of technique, it wasn't like it was under the direction of one group of one human intellect or group of human intellects. It was kind of not thinking about the law of diminishing returns. Well, it's really efficient. We just keep doing it, and then you get caught in this trap where you can't back out because so much of what you need is dependent upon that system. Nathan C.J. Hood, Minoan, yeah, that makes sense. Then it's exporting it through the empire. The manifestation of the Faustian will to conquer and control all space and time. I mean, we have to remember, though, there was resistance within England itself, which was defeated. The Luddites were the most famous. We need to return to King Lud. It sort of like it started in England and Belgium, but then it spread very rapidly from there. Let's see. No, so not reading people's signals is a component of the autist. There are more autists than ever. Are autists more in tune with? Yes, Manoan. Autists are more in tune with the machine. That's the whole point. They're There's a reason why they have a large overlap with groups like engineers, computer programmers, and finance. Hmm. I'm sure that's a complete coincidence, and that's a hate fact. But I'll keep moving. Is Modem Man over sublimated? Uh, no. No, I don't think he sublimates very much at all, Emmy. Credible threat. I remember when computers used to scream when they connected to the internet. What did the modem know that we didn't? That's good. It was a Lovecraftian warning of the terror of the machine coming after you. Paul Moosefoot, the modems tried to warn us with that noise. I know, right? I know. Alex Berry, do you think maybe male autism are just men who are more accustomed to machines as opposed to men? Yes, yes, that's a very, very good example. That's something that I think no one just brought up. Yes. Or conversely, autism is given to men who don't fit into the system, because there were times when I was diagnosed as autistic. I'm like, well, but that was because I wasn't fitting in with the machine. So depending on who's making the judgment, it could be either or. But yeah, in the colloquial slang use, it's probably those people. Oh, let's see. Cyber Ninja Zero, ethno state, autist state. Yeah, well, more or less 100% overlap. There's no Venn diagram at all there. What does sublimation mean in this context? Who are you referring to? Oh, yeah, he was referring to ME, I think it was. Let's see. Sublimation, and if you're referring to ME, I don't exactly know what he means, but sublimation generally means taking one desire and then redirecting it some other way. Usually that's the sexual desire, and it's sublimated by redirecting it into some other pursuit, like intellectual pursuits. Manoa, my gut says autists don't fit in with the machine. Well, I mean, maybe. Doubting Thomas, calling normal masculine behavior autistic is just how the machine demonizes men who could pose a threat to the system. I mean, yeah, I agree. That's definitely a common use. Ryan Young, Emmy, sublimating our natures to appease the machine. Well, you see, I don't know if it's sublimating as so much as effacing, because if you sublimate a desire, you don't get rid of it, you don't destroy it, you redirect it. Whereas the machine, in turning us into modems, is in some sense trying to destroy our humanity. You could argue that's the source of alienation we struggle with. Ryan Young, sublimation to me means a solid goes directly to a gas. That's the scientific term. Well, given that we live in a scientific age, maybe they want us to go from a solid to a gas. Cyber Ninja Zero. Manoa and autists are the perfection of the machine, and the machine cannot bear a stage of it to be perfected, because then it would stagnate and not grow further. Well, then you get into accelerationism, and I don't know. Maybe that's when it ends. Oh, I got it, Cyber Ninja Zero. Okay, it won't stagnate. That'll lead to the culminating point for accelerationism, which will be the end of the machine. And since the machine doesn't want to end yet, it's preventing the culminating point of acceleration. So there we go. Let's see. Did I miss anybody in the chat who joined? Let's see. Oh, Voltra. I did miss somebody. Hello. Oh, not that, Doubting Thomas. Solid human beings to gaseous consciousness in the cloud. Wow, that's a stinker. All right, everybody. That's tonight's show. The Modem Society and the Modem Man. Oh, wait, yeah. Jorge Punta, will you make a reading list? A reading list for what? On escaping the machine? or something else. Cyber Ninja Zero. I mean that autists have regimented and patterned minds completely at odds with the social upheaval of the machine. Oh, well, you need to explain that. Sounds interesting. Let's see. Well, we're waiting. Here. Autists need to stay to the technology. Yeah, I do have a reading list for escaping the understanding technology, Jorge Punza. I'll probably put that out pretty soon. Cyber Ninja Zero. Autists need to stay in the stage they know, but in the stage they are the masters. All right. Well, thanks, everyone. Thanks for tuning in. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.